Hello and welcome to another episode of TV on TV. I'm State Representative Tommy Vitolo. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group. Today is Thursday, November 5th, 2020, which is sort of like day two post-election, and we're all still sort of recovering. I will tell you that my yesterday morning was blocked off for me to just sit on the couch and eat tortilla chips and salsa all morning long until I felt really gross. But that was my time to kind of breathe in all of the election results and try to understand what's going on locally, regionally, nationally. And so I want to start with the news as I always do before we go over to our guest, Brookline Democratic Town Committee Chair Cindy Rowe. And that's going to come in a few minutes. But first, I just want to sort of hit you with a couple of pieces of news. There's not much outside of the elections. Yesterday, we in the House did pass a flame retardant restriction bill supported by firefighters. So it turns out there are some chemicals that are flame retardants, but those chemicals are linked to cancers that show up in the bodies of firefighters far more frequently than anybody else. Well, why would that be? Because they cause that cancer when they burn. And so if we reduce the number of things in our households that have those chemicals, we're doing well by our firefighters. A very, very similar bill passed 2 years ago. The governor pocket vetoed it at the end of last session. So we went ahead and passed it again this session. I'm hopeful that it does become law. Other than that, let's just talk election news. And we don't do this often, but I'm going to call up some visuals here. Mostly you just get to look at me, but we did have we had an election in Brookline and, of course, across the state and the nation. The local news is pretty straightforward. Question 3, which was an initiative to allow for a short-term or temporary property tax increase to buy some parcels, what I would describe as in Middle Brookline, near Newberry College, or at Newberry College, I should say. That passed overwhelmingly by more than a 2-to-1 margin. And so now town meeting has to do its best to deal with that over the next month or two. Across the state, of course, ballot initiative question 1, the right to repair. These are the people who voted yes. Gray are communities that haven't turned in their results yet. So it passed overwhelmingly, about 75 to 25. Question 2 is the ranked choice voting question. And that failed 45 to 55. You can sort of do the analysis for yourself quickly, looking at the map. What communities supported it and which ones didn't. Brookline, of course, did support it, and I supported it personally, but it was not enough to get it across the finish line. We had a congressional race, of course, Massachusetts 4, where Democratic first-time candidate for Congress, Jake Auchincloss, emerged victorious. He got, remember the fraction, but I'm surprised it's not on here, unfortunately. I think it was about 60-40, but don't hold me to that. And so Jake is now Congressman-elect. And we also had a race for sheriff. That was the McDermott race. Well, sure enough, McDermott won. Pat McDermott was the Democratic challenger. And he won his seats, or the communities that voted for him are the ones in blue. There was also this, you may have heard about it, there was a race for president of the United States of America. I don't know if you were aware of that, but there was. It is still, as of noon on Thursday, we're pre-recording for our 2:30 show, undecided. It looks likely that Joe Biden will have 270 electoral votes, at least in accordance with the Electoral College allocation method. Whether or not those electoral collegians, or whatever it is we call them, vote that way, or if there's some faithlessness, remains to be seen. But it looks likely that Biden will win Nevada. And although President Trump is currently winning in Pennsylvania and North Carolina and Georgia, the votes they are counting now are overwhelmingly in favor of former Vice President Joe Biden. He may catch up and, in fact, pass President Trump's totals in any one of those three states. Nevada alone gets him to 270, and that should be enough to win. Any of those other states, of course, would be bonus. Alaska is also not yet called. That is almost certainly going to be 3 electoral votes for President Donald Trump. So, having said all of that, it's time to chat with Brookline Democratic Town Committee Chair Cindy Rowe. Cindy, I'm delighted that you were able to come on the show today. I know you're very busy this time of year, so thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Tommy. Well, I guess we're in the place everybody said we were going to be, where the election was not decided on election day, election night. But, that's not really unusual. It takes a long time to count ballots that come in by mail and ballots that come in from overseas. And what we're seeing this year, because of the pandemic, is that number is so far multiplied. And town election officials across the state, across the nation, are still counting those ballots. And that's what everybody told us to anticipate. So that's where we are. We just have to be patient.
And just to remind folks, certainly pre-pandemic, there were mail-in ballots not used anywhere near this extent. But there's also a federal law that says that if you are serving in the military or a family member of someone in the military, your ballot doesn't have to arrive until November 16th. And so, strictly speaking, in every state in the country, we're not done counting until November 16th, period, the end, right? So why is it then that prior to this year, it felt like we knew on election night? What's different this time?
Well, I think the extent to how many ballots were done by early voting, done by mail-in, done by overseas, it just, the volume is just so much more. And it was because of the pandemic. And, we all know and how we ended up here by bad management of the pandemic. So, we have to sit and be patient. I said to somebody the other day, I said, it's like, when you have the kid in the back of the seat who says, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And the answer is, we're not there yet, but you got to be patient. So hang tight, everybody. We're not there yet, but I do have faith that at the end of this journey, we will be swearing in Joe Biden as our next president.
When my family is driving down the pike and my children ask, are we there yet? I simply say, yeah, get out. And they stop asking.
Well, funny, Tommy, that you say that, because if we said that right now, get out right now, Joe Biden would be the president as of this moment, because he's won an overwhelming number of popular votes. And if we stopped counting right now, he would have enough electoral votes likely. So we're going to be there. Just hang tight. A couple more hours.
Now, there's been certainly a lot of calls, often from the left, but I think also from other parts of our spectrum, saying, count all the votes. You got to count all the votes, right? Almost as if this is a new idea. But did we count all the votes in 2016, or did we just count most of them and then stop?
All the votes are counted. I think the difference is that the number of mail-in votes were not the margin in any of the states, so it didn't matter as much. This year, it really matters. The votes are going to be tight. We're going to see margins tightening. Don't worry, it's going to be fine. But the volume of the mail-in votes makes a big difference this year. So we have to hang in there. And it's a democratic principle to count every vote. I like to say that this is how we respect the voters. These voters went so far beyond this year to vote. We all saw the pictures of people standing in those early voting lines for hours. We know that people had to overcome all kinds of voter suppression techniques. There were things like, in some states, you needed to get a witness to sign your absentee ballot. It's a pandemic. What if you live alone? They really made some of these conditions near impossible for people to vote, and yet they did. We have not seen voting numbers like this, perhaps ever, for a presidential race. When Joe Biden wins this race, he will win with the highest number of votes of any candidate ever in a presidential race.
Now, historically, one of the ways that candidates and political parties and even interest groups will try to help influence the outcome of the election is to go door to door and find people who could vote and sort of drag them by the ear to the polls and get them to vote. But obviously, that was not a common effort this year. I'm not saying there was no door to door activity, but there was certainly very little. And so, was anything done to replace that? And where did people in Brookline line up for that? Obviously, we weren't going door to door in Brookline reminding folks to vote for Joe Biden. So how did Brookline fit into get out the vote efforts in 2020?
People always ask that at the beginning of every election cycle. I'm here in Brookline, even I'm here in Massachusetts. What impact could I possibly have on the national election? Well, it turns out we can have a big impact on national elections. So what happened this year in our state was we took all of our volunteers and we leveraged that volunteer energy and spread it out all over the country. So just as an example, we worked with an organization called Reclaim Our Vote. And this organization pinpointed people in states around the country where there was low registration and low participation. And we started about a year ago working with them. Many people in our town did postcards. We did postcards to states like Georgia and Texas and North Carolina, Florida, um, every place, so many states where people, mostly in minority communities, Black communities, brown communities, places that had been targeted for voter suppression, where the Republicans had really tried to clamp down on those voting laws. And we sent postcards to those people to say, this is how you register. Please check to see that you haven't been purged from the voting rolls. If you have been purged, this is how you get back on. And we did it in time for them to get back on for the presidential election. And we did it in time for them to order absentee ballots. We called them, we texted them to make sure that they got their ballots, that they knew how to participate in early voting. And if they hadn't done that, how they could find their polling places, many of which had been closed, and how to find drop boxes. Some counties only had one drop box for hundreds of thousands of people. So we made sure that they had a voting plan and knew how to get those ballots in and have those ballots counted. And that came from Massachusetts. We had thousands of volunteers in Massachusetts, both from the Democratic Town Committee and from the other organization, my other hat, JALSA, the Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action. So we started early on, and we really had an impact. We contacted over 150,000 people in those states.
Now, in addition to reaching out with postcards and other methods, I know some folks were able to find some money to contribute to candidates or to causes, and I certainly one of the newer and seemingly very effective ways to grab all of this energy was force multiplier, which I know you were very involved in. Can you tell us what the heck I'm talking about? What is force multiplier? What did it do? And what was its secret sauce? Why was it so effective?
Oh, this is a great story. So right after Trump was elected, I started getting phone calls, multiple phone calls, 20, 25 phone calls from people who said, I have my friends gathered in my living room. We need to know what to do. This is so terrible. What can we do here? So after I got all these calls and I realized that I could not possibly go to all these different living rooms, I said, let's put this together. Let's all get together, one living room, one meeting, and at least we'll see what you all want to do. Let's talk. And we put everybody together in one room. We went around. We found out that between all the listservs and websites and Facebook pages these folks had put together, we had a reach of 10,000 people. And we said, wow, this is really interesting. So from that, a group broke off, became a steering committee, decided that one of the most important things we could do was focus on flipping the house. And we started raising money. And we said, let's see where this goes. People started writing to their friends. We started something called relational fundraising, where we would put out an invitation and then people would send it out to their groups. And by the time we knew it, just looking at what we did over the last 4 years, we raised $6 million for candidates across the country. Senate candidates who had a chance to take seats in the Senate back from Republicans or open seats, House seats that needed to be preserved now that we had flipped the House. We needed to make sure we secured the House, and to support our upcoming president, Joe Biden, to make sure that he was competitive. We also invested in groups around the country through something called the Movement Voter Project. We invested in 65 different groups who were on the ground in competitive battleground states who were working to get people signed up to vote. And through all those investments, Force Multiplier raised money from 8,500 people, over $6 million, held over 200 house parties, many of those on Zoom once we had to go there because of COVID. And it was just a phenomenal effort. And now we have this group that is looking forward to keep going and seeing how we can keep influencing elections across the country to make sure that people with our values are ones that hold those seats.
Now, some folks might be thinking, oh, 2022, I'm such a political junkie. We're not even done with 2020 yet. And what are we going to do for 2022? But Cindy, we still have some US Senate elections in 2020 left, don't we?
Oh, it's never over. There's never a time to relax. Yeah, the Senate's not settled. There'll be some runoffs. There's some undecided elections right now. We don't even know where we're going to end up right now. But there's will be a runoff in Georgia. So, things keep continuing. We're never stopping.
So it's possible that that in any number of hats that you wear, but perhaps especially Force Multiplier, you're going to be busy in the near term, right? Because those Georgia runoffs are in December, and it's only November 5th, which means there's some time to have some effect there. If you have something already teed up, I'd love to hear about it. I forgive you if 2 days after the election you don't have your big plan yet. But should we at least be looking out for something? You think that something might happen with Force Multiplier between now and then?
Well, I'll tell you, Force Multiplier did support both Warnock and Ossoff in Georgia. So we are very deeply invested in Georgia, and we will be looking to see what we can do next. So heads up for what comes next out of Force Multiplier.
Now I want to pivot a little bit. We've got a little bit of time left, and some of my viewers certainly know about the Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action, JALSA. I think I've got that right. But I bet you've got it right, Cindy. Cindy, you're the executive director. Tell us about JALSA and what JALSA is thinking about, maybe separate from elections, but relevant to certainly politics and government.
So interestingly enough, JALSA does have JALSA, which is our C3, where we work on all kinds of issues: social, economic, environmental, and racial justice. That's our mission. And we also have JALSA Impact, which is a C4 that works on more political work. So we at one point said, look, we can change all the policies, but if we don't have the policy makers in place, there's only so far you can get. Sometimes you got to change the policy makers in order to make sure the policies are in place. So we are working on things from both angles. From our C3, from JALSA, what we do is we take our mission, we look at it, and we find campaigns and legislation that we want to work on to advance it. So for instance, we're working on a campaign for progressive revenues right now to make sure that the state can pay for all of our priorities: education, transportation. We want emergency sick time to make sure that workers who come down with COVID don't have to go to work, don't feel compelled to go to work, can stay home, can take care of themselves and their families and not spread COVID. So it's a public health issue as well. We're looking at the Rowe Act which is something that because of the Supreme Court situation now, we feel compelled that we have to pass in our state to protect abortion laws in our state. We work on gun violence prevention laws. We work on immigration, big issue for JALSA, getting a driver's license for all immigrants, regardless of their status. This is a way that we can make sure that immigrants are safe and that if they get detained, if they get stopped, that it doesn't mean that they will be separated from their families and deported. You think a driver's license, something you take for granted, what's the big deal? A driver's license. Well, for us, if we get stopped, so it's a warning, it's a ticket, what's the big deal? But if you are driving and get stopped and your immigration status is in doubt, that means that you could be separated from your family and deported. So, this is a big issue. Safe Communities Act to make sure that our immigrants get due process. If you are locked up and detained and somebody says to you, well, ICE would like to come in and interview you, you don't have the knowledge to say, do I have to speak to them? You speak to them, but you don't have to. And we have to make sure that immigrants get due process and aren't asked about their immigration status when they call the police. We don't want an immigrant not to be able to talk to the police, not to say that they witnessed a crime. If they're in a domestic violence situation, not to call the police. These are things that we take for granted. So we're working on so many different issues, but the bottom line is for us, dignity and respect for every person. That's our faith values. Our faith values tell us that we have to respect and dignify every person. And when you take that as your basis, as your foundation, then all of these policies just flow from there.
So we've got a bunch of folks who are paying attention to the sort of the it's the Super Bowl, it's the World Series, right? We're watching the event, and even if even if folks aren't sports fans every day, they're sports fans for the World Series and for the Super Bowl. Same thing with presidential elections, right? There's a whole bunch of folks who are tuned in, who aren't tuned in most of the rest of the time. And by tuned in, I mean watching, but I also mean, hey, they voted, right? They took a specific action. They did a thing that said that they are participating in the community. And so what, under any of the hats that you wear, right, what are you doing to try to capture some of these folks' attention ongoing to keep them plugged in a little more so they can add their voices to your efforts?
Well, Tommy, that is really a critical question because right now there's been such heightened attention to not only elections, but what do the elections mean? What does the election of Joe Biden over Donald Trump symbolize for us, for our nation? For me, I like to think it is a rejection of the politics of bigotry and hatred and division, that people realize that we need to work on these problems together as a country, that we need to make judgments that are sound, policy-based, science-based, and that's the direction we want to go in. So now that we have that attention from all these people, we had over 1,250 people mailing those postcards that I mentioned before. That's a huge number of volunteers who participated, not only went to vote, but actually participated in making those votes happen. Converting that energy into the ongoing energy of making policy. That's where we all need to be paying attention right now. Because if you were motivated enough to want to say, I'm going to reach out to voters in Georgia and North Carolina and Florida and Texas, you were doing that for a reason. And whatever your personal reason was it because you were rejecting this politics of bigotry, or because you had an issue that you cared about, whether you cared about abortion rights or housing or healthcare or climate change, whatever issue it was that was motivating you, making that connection between what we are doing in elections and how that translates to policy, and having an ongoing role in making sure those policies are enacted and carried out is where we all, as organizers, have to be thinking right now. And we can't let up for a minute. There is no sleep. Maybe there's one night of sleep, but there's no more than one night of sleep between the elections and making that connection for all the people who came out to volunteer. Nobody can think that we're done now. That's my greatest fear, that anybody thinks we're done. We are absolutely not. When Joe Biden takes that office, we are going to go right on working to make sure that everything we did all this work for to get him elected comes to fruition. And that's on the state level too. So many policies are decided on the state level, and the role that you have is so important as a state legislator. There are so many things before you right now that will impact people's lives here in our state. And I can't tell you how much work it is to try to move some of this legislation and how important it is to get it done. So thank you for whatever you are doing to have to push through those bills.
Thank you, Cindy. In fact, we've got some budget work this week and next. But in addition to that, both the Senate president and the speaker have said abortion rights are on the agenda in 2020. And that's really exciting. This is a bit of inside baseball. Cindy, as you know, historically on even numbered years, the legislature doesn't take any action in the second half of the year. We finish the budget, we go into election cycle, and that's it. But because COVID essentially turned off the legislature back in the spring and early summer, when we historically have been most active in policy, we couldn't at the time. So we're catching up. We're making up for lost time. And so I expect that we'll do something on abortion rights. I don't know if it will be the Rowe Act or not. There's been some conversation about some other issues too. I don't know if there are going to be any that are going to get as much attention as that, or sort of as visceral as that. But we also, of course, have 5 bills in conference committee. We have police reform, we have climate, we have economic development, we have some healthcare language that allows for more telehealth, more conversations like this to replace people getting together, which is so important both for access and for cost. Those bills also, of course, have to, the House and Senate versions have to be reconciled and then brought back to the legislature to be voted on again. And so, right, there's no question that advocacy is really important right now at the state level, because if we stop now, we won't have done enough, in my view, and I'm sure Cindy and yours as well, in this 2-year window. But if we finish what we started and hopefully push a few more things like the Rowe Act across the finish line, we will be in a position to say, hey, through COVID, we still got some important things done. And, COVID is obviously a real challenge for the budget. But we had a meeting today with House Ways and Means Chair Michaelwitz, and we talked about the budget. And the good news is it's not as dire as we had thought it was going to be. The bad news is we're still about $4 billion less revenue than we had a year ago at this time. And that's $4 billion in ways that the state typically is able to help people that we simply will not be able to do this year. And so the question is, what are we going to not do? And that's a really important conversation over the next week. Are we going to not provide rental assistance for folks who are nearing homelessness? Are we going to not support public education, K-12 or higher ed? What are we going to not do? And that's a real challenge. And I think, Cindy, as you know, organizations like JALSA are critical to helping shape that conversation.
Well, Tommy, I would say that the question really is a choice between what won't you do and raising revenue. The legislature always has the option to raise more revenue. There are a lot of corporations that have made a lot of money during this pandemic, and there are proposals to put more taxes on the profits that have been made, not your mom and pop shops that are struggling. We're not talking about that. But we are talking about some big corporations that have made billions of dollars. And those corporations could pay a little more to support people who have been paying for their products and their services. It's not impossible. We don't have to make those choices if we don't want to. It really is in the legislature's hands to decide that.
And you make a great point. And some folks will argue that, well, even if we do get new revenue, it's a year before it arrives, and that's too late. And actually, that's not correct. While it is true that if we made a tax policy change, it might take a year for the revenue to flow in, we have some flexibility with the rainy day fund. And so if we knew more revenue was coming in a year from now, we would feel more comfortable taking more rainy day fund money out this year, knowing that we will replenish it next year. So you're absolutely right. It remains to be seen whether or not the House will push any new revenue. I personally am in support of it. I know the House has been frustrated that in 2020, we have voted to get more revenue in transportation and the Senate didn't move on it. And so there's some tension about who should go next, the House or the Senate. Hopefully those differences are resolved shortly. And we come out with a budget that represents our values and supports those who need to be supported. Cindy Rowe, Executive Director of JALSA, Chair, Brookline Democratic Town Committee, neighbor, longtime resident, and Brookline Interactive Group supporter. Cindy, thank you so much for being on TV. And we'll see you all next week. Thanks so much for watching.